We are going to talk about the benefits and cost effectiveness of room heat pumps and how we developed these forecasts. So I'm going to kick things off here and just kind of introduce the topic. And then I'm going to hand it over to Gory and then Matt from the Cadmus team to sort of take us a little farther into the details. And then I'll come back and wrap up at the end to talk about evaluation. So let's see if I can get this. Oh, okay. So here's the plan. I'm going to give you high-level overview of TSB and cost effectiveness numbers, which are updated from what you saw in your plan. I'm going to explain that. I'm going to give you the 10,000 foot level of how we modeled this. Like I said, then I'm going to turn over to Gory, who's going to be remote here, presenting how we developed our market adoption forecast. And then Matt's going to go with cost effectiveness, and I'm going to wrap up with evaluation. So let's start with the numbers. So you will, first thing you will notice, let me first walk through the numbers and then I'll make a few points. So the updated total system benefit for room heat pumps total is now 521 million. That is higher than what you had in your packet. Like I said, I'm going to explain that in a minute. Wow. You also see that there's a second way that we can calculate TSB that we must calculate TSB for the societal cost test. You'll see the TSB is much higher there at $1.4 billion. That is because the societal cost test includes more GHG benefits, and it also has a much lower discount rate. So everything is valued more highly. Down below, you see the different cost effectiveness tests, the different ratios. Let me explain the TRC quickly. You see that crazy high number, 330.15. The reason that looks like that is because we have scenarios of adoption where there are actually negative incremental measure costs. Again, we're going to go through more of that in detail. If we leave those values as negative, it drives up the TRC number like this. So we also did a version, which is not California policy, but we thought we should do it anyway to just try to make more sense of it, which is we modified the negative incremental measure cost values to 0. So when they were negative, we just set them at 0. We said, what does a TRC look like in those cases? So those are, and the other ratios. So those are the differences that you see here. Doesn't have any influence on the PAC test, which again, Matt's going to explain all these tests to you, why they look different. So this is the basic overview of numbers. So I already said these are updated from the plan. I'm going to explain that in a minute. The other thing that I want to mention real quickly is some of you may notice, yes.
Quick clarification,
Yes.
under the societal cost test,
Yeah.
that number of parentheses, that's negative?
Negative, yes. Yes. Some of you may have noticed that these numbers are quite different than when we estimated it for the advancement plan. The TSB numbers were substantially higher when we did that estimate. And I just wanted to quickly cover off on that and say, there's a few reasons for that. It's a really good illustration of how the research that we did during phase 2 that you approved, or that that we decided to advance that investment in that research in phase 2, then informed our ability to get a much better estimate of a much better forecast for TSB. In this particular case, the biggest changes had to do with the fact that in that early preliminary estimate, we had not subtracted out, we had not yet estimated what we thought IOU verified impacts would be, which is what we've agreed to do to get to incremental. So we hadn't done that yet. So that was a big change. We also had not we had also estimated at a statewide level. We had not adjusted for just the amount of change that would occur within IOU service territory. So that was also a big reduction in the estimate. And then there were just some modeling assumptions that changed based on what we learned in market research. So like one of them was how many units per household would there generally be of portable units, things like that, that we were able to refine through our research. Okay, so I'm going to now explain the adjustment of the numbers from what you saw in the plan. First, I want to just take you back to ground you in, this is something that you would have seen in the evaluation framework. It's basically a comparison. Oh, it didn't, sorry. This slide basically compares how we calculate cost effectiveness for resource acquisition programs versus for market transformation programs. This table appears in the evaluation framework. We discussed it way back when, but it's already been like over a year, probably since we discussed this. Just to walk through it quickly, for resource acquisition programs, anything that results from codes and standards is not included. That's a separate program in California. For market transformation programs, we do include impacts from codes and standards when an MTI is proposed to lead to a new code or standard. So when part of the logic model is that, then we consider the inclusion, and the decision had some very specific guidance about how we do that. Again, just contrasting resource acquisition versus market transformation, how we calculate cost effectiveness. The next one is the really important one here for me to explain why things changed. So the time frame over which we forecast costs and benefits for resource acquisition, it's the program funding period. For market transformation, it's over the program lifetime. So if you think about that graph that Lynette showed you in her introduction, showing how the investment is kind of concentrated in the first several years, and then the benefits accrue over time. This is the reason why for a market transformation program, we have to look over the lifetime, because the whole several years, in this case, beginning of the program, is to, market transformation. We talk about creating structural market changes that lead to lasting long-term change. So it takes several years to implement the strategic interventions, to get those structural market changes that then allow the market to transform. So that's why largely the benefits come in the out years. And this is why, coming back to the slide here, the time frame of forecasted costs and benefits needs to be the lifetime. You see a footnote there that you probably can't read. Basically what that says is that we've defined lifetime as 20 years from inception, or 20 years from the beginning of phase 3, the beginning of when we are approved to go out into the market and really begin to make those structural market changes. And the rest here is not really the focus. It's just what you'll see in the evaluation framework. We net to gross is handled differently. Incremental costs are handled differently. So I will also note that these same points have been discussed in California and by the CPUC for a decade now. They were the topic in large part of a white paper by Brawl and Ken Keating that was published in 2014 that is referenced in the decision. Yeah, Fred.
So when you're doing the societal tests, do you still subtract the utility impacts and costs?
Yes. Yes. Although it's an interesting question. I mean, I think I see where you're headed with that, but we did do that consistently.
It is
Okay, yeah, we can.
But we need to argue that utility savings are highly influenced by the market transformation initiative. Market transformation savings are highly influenced by the utility initiative.
Yes.
The separation is an important accounting artifice in terms of benefit, causality, and merit. They mean more together. than they do separately. I recognize that accounting is difficult if you're trying to track all these different parties are doing, but I mean, in the Northwest, there's something called co-created savings. Yeah.
Very
This is the
exciting.
equivalent of it. It just doesn't seem to be getting that. Who's doing what? Let's see the bottom.
When we get through Matt's presentation, if we want to bring this back, I have some comments to make. I don't want to take us away from just this first thing that we're going to want to try to explain, but it's a good topic. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering how you modeled the utility verified tax grid like that.
Corey is going to talk about that. I know this is hard, kind of just giving you like, this is the teaser, but these guys are going to get into it. The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure you're comfortable with the fact that the numbers changed from what we sent you. And so I wanted to ground it here to explain the 20-year lifetime. And then this is really my helping visualize kind of what happens here. So if you look at the period here, you see 2024 on the left to 2045 on the right. That comprises phase 2, which for this MTI has been 2 years. We're hoping we get out of phase 2 and get approval for phase 3. For other MTIs, it could be shorter or longer. Hopefully not. I mean, shorter would be hard. It could be shorter or longer. The phase 3 in this case, for purposes of calculating cost effectiveness, is 20 years. And that is our plan, is for it to always be 20 years from inception. In this case, we're hoping 2026. During that 20-year period, we won't be in active market deployment the whole time. Don't take the exact line of market deployment versus long-term tracking. That's not meant to be precise. It's just meant to show that over that 20 years, some of it is just we're tracking because we have to continue to track as those benefits accrue. So this was our intention. I think in our eagerness to make sure we included all the costs from phase 2, we sort of inadvertently on the first pass took 20 years from 2024 instead of taking 20 years from 2026. So that the numbers you saw in the draft we sent out, we just didn't have time. We didn't want to hold up the draft anymore. We just didn't have time to do that update to get it out before. That's why Stacy sent the memo kind of summarizing that, and now these numbers are different.
So we are, as Karen said, just to avoid confusion of like suddenly, wait a minute, I saw one thing and then I clicked again and it was different. We are going to update these numbers in the plans after this meeting. And so those will get posted. We'll send you a note, but we thought it was important for Karen to give the context and share it.
I believe that little footnote that you read us a couple of slides back said that impacts will be measured 20 years from the point that implementation begins, but costs will also include those phase 2 costs. So there's a longer time period for costs versus benefits. And that I wanted to make sure that is the intention. So it's 20 plus on costs and 20 on benefits.
Yes.
Great.
Yes, and that intention to include the cost is what I don't want to
Lift
say
off the
momentarily, it was actually for a few days, but it was long enough that like, okay, we got to get this out. We momentarily got ourselves with the wrong time period for benefits. But it is important. Once again, think of the graphic that Lynette showed you, and Corey's going to show you another graphic that makes it really, really clear, like why it's important not to lop off those benefits. Oh, sorry, I didn't put that before. Sorry. So that was what we did before. Okay, so I am now going to give you the 10,000-foot level of the forecasting approach. And you're not going to ask me too many detailed questions because that is the whole rest of the presentation. But I really think before we dive into the details, it's helpful to get this like big picture look at it. Okay, so again, we had to forecast market adoption, and then we had to forecast cost effectiveness over that 20-year period. It all begins with first defining the technology. We have to know what we're forecasting. Then, once we defined the technology, we did a whole bunch of research. We did product research, we did market characterization research to learn more about these markets. So if we're going to forecast adoption, we better know as much as we can about the market. We also use that market characterization to come up with the MTI plan that you now have in your hands and the MT theory. Okay, now get a little more complicated. So the market characterization research helped us build these market adoption models because as Gory's going to walk through with you, the models have parameters, they have inputs, assumptions, and we want those all to be grounded in research. We want them to be meticulously documented. We're forecasting here, all right? So how did we come up with the assumptions that we used to forecast? So they are very much grounded in the research that we did. And so we developed a baseline market adoption forecast. Again, this is what Gory's about to walk you through. We also developed a total market adoption forecast. So the baseline is the counterfactual, what would happen if we didn't fund this thing? What do we forecast is going to happen in the market without this MTI, without this market transformation investment? The total market adoption forecast is what we forecast will happen with the interventions that Elaine has walked through and that are detailed in the plan. If we do those things, the total market adoption forecast is what we believe will happen. So you see the arrow from the MT plan and theory going into the total market adoption forecast. The other thing we have to forecast, I think this is Kian's question. We have to forecast utility verified net unit adoption. Again, Gory's going to explain that also goes in since we have to subtract it to come up with incremental market adoption forecast. So this is again, 10,000 foot view. Then we also have the cost effectiveness piece. So to get the cost effectiveness, well, first, let me just say over there on the right where you were just looking, of course, the market adoption forecast is a huge input to the cost effectiveness modeling because that's where all the benefits derive from, right? We have to know how many units are going to be adopted and the incremental units are going to be adopted into the market. We also have to take our research, understand the installation use cases so that we can get to an estimate of incremental measure costs. We use load shapes to get to unit energy impacts and avoided costs. That all goes into the cost effectiveness modeling and TSV modeling. And then the one box there that I didn't cover, MTI costs, obviously that goes in the world of benefits and costs. That's one of the costs, the program costs. So again, this is just meant to give you this like an orientation to what's about to come. Gory's going to be talking about all that blue. Matt's going to be talking about the bottom part here on the cost. With that,
So Gory,
I will pass it to
so we have Gory Mishra from Cadmus, Senior Associate at Cadmus, who's gonna share the market adoption forecast content. And Gory, can you can hear us okay?
I can just.
I can hear you okay. Can you folks hear me okay?
And yeah, thank you. Loud and clear. Okay, yeah. Wait,
Turn it down a little bit. Yeah, that would be great.
Well, I mean, Gory, can you speak?
yeah, Gory, maybe just pull away from your mic a little bit. It's really loud. I know we wanted it
Okay.
louder before.
Is this better now?
Yeah. Feedback for him all
I
week.
know, poor thing. Okay,
Okay.
great.
Um,
And thank you. We'll advance for you, Gory.
Yeah, let's go on to the next slide, please.
Sorry.
I think Karen has spoken, has already defined these different terms. The one thing I would just mention again is the last one, the net incremental adoption. And that's TMA minus BMA minus the utility verified units. In this presentation, I'll focus a lot on how did we estimate BMA and TMA, and then deal briefly with the last two boxes you see here. Next slide, please. This and the next two slides gives the results of our market adoption model. In this slide, we show the saturation of room heat pumps in terms of proportion of households who will adopt the product. The left figure gives results for single-family households. The right one gives the results for existing multifamily households. If you focus on just one of the two figures, the bottom solid teal line, that gives the BMA forecast, and the red solid line on the top is the TMA. The yellow area in between represents the incremental adoption attributed to the MTI interventions, TMA minus BMA. The graphs here and our model forecasts go through 2050, and the graphs also extend to 2050. However, for the purpose of this project, we used adoption estimates for the period 2024 to 2045, as Karen had just mentioned. Diving deep into one of the figure for single family, I've drawn a vertical line on 2045. So the 2% represents the proportion of single family households who will adopt the room heat pump in the baseline by 2045. In presence of the MTI, we estimated around 14% of single family households will adopt the product. In other words, the difference of 14% minus 2%, so 12 percentage points may be attributed to the MTI. There are two insights from the graph that I want to highlight. The first is, if you look at either of the two graphs, you'll see very limited adoption in the baseline until close to 2040. And in case of in case of TMA, very limited adoption until about 2031 or so. Now that's directly linked to one of the key barriers that Elaine had presented, which is availability of products that are California appropriate. So type 2, type 3 products that fit sliding windows, which is the dominant form of windows in California. In the baseline, based on our conversations with subject matter experts, manufacturers, and others, many of these products are expected to be cost effective and expected to be introduced in the market, by mid of 2030s. In presence of the MTI, and that's one of the MTI milestone, these products will be in the market by 2029. So the takeoff that you see is directly linked to that main barrier that Elaine had presented. The second interesting fact that I want to highlight here is, the adoption among the expected saturation among multifamily households is way higher than that of single family households. And I'll talk more about that in the next slides. Let's move on to the next slide, please. In this slide, I converted the proportions to number of households. If everyone must be knowing this, we have approximately 8.7 million single-family households and 4.3 million multifamily households. So even if multifamily households have a greater proportion who are adopting in terms of absolute number, it's slightly less than a single-family household. Next slide. Before that, again, Karen talked about extending from 2043 to 2045. And if you look at the area between the two vertical lines, either for single family and multifamily, that shows sort of the impact from moving out by 2 years. That's the time when many of the interventions are implemented and the benefits of the market transformation are starting to get realized. And hence, the change of 2 years has a large impact on both adoption and TSP calculations. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, this is the third result file, and what you see here is data disaggregated by single family and multifamily. Here the results are in terms of number of units of room heat pump. Until now, I have been talking in terms of number of households. The first three columns gives us the TMA, the BMA, and the RA verified units, RA program verified units. The net incremental, as we had mentioned, is TMA minus BMA minus RA verified units. The final two columns, the last but one column is the adoption that is attributed to households who are not in the IOU service territory. This is approximately 26% of California-wide adoption. And we subtract that number to come up with the last column. And the last column is what is used for calculation of cost effectiveness. So approximately 1.7 billion, 1.7 million units of RHP is what is used for cost effectiveness calculation. I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, next couple of slides, I'm going to talk first about modeling methods and then the modeling assumptions that we made. We used a S-curve to model adoption of RHPs in both baseline and in presence of the MTI, BMA and TMA. As many of you may know, S-curve is very widely used to model diffusion of new technologies. It is characterized by, on the left side, you have the initial slow growth phase, and then there is a rapid growth phase in the center of the S. And then it gradually plateaus and as it reaches saturation, which is the maximum potential, the maximum market size. To come up with an S-curve in both BMA and TMA, there are three parameters that are key to estimating. The first one is the market potential. Market potential refers to the maximum number or maximum proportion of households that we believe will eventually adopt RHP. This represents the upper limit of the S-curve, beyond which you won't have any further adoption. So this is sort of the ceiling, the maximum possible adoption. The second one is a year of inflection. This is the year or the time when adoption rate of heat pumps reaches its peak growth. Did anyone have a question?
No. Oh, maybe someone online.
Okay, I'll then continue. So this is sort of the turning point where the adoption sort of transitions from accelerating growth to deaccelerating growth. So before this, the year-on-year growth in adoption is increasing. After this, the year-on-year growth is sort of in a decreasing trend. And then the last one is the rate of growth. This represents the steepness of the S-curve. And to come up with BMA and TMA, as I'm going to discuss in the next few slides, the entire exercise is to figure out what should be the values of these three parameters. Let's move to the next slide, please. So in case of baseline, the assumptions that we make for the values of the three parameters are driven by the market research. Specifically discussion with market players, including subject matter experts and manufacturers. We also conducted a survey of households and property managers. That was a big input. We were also guided by inputs from a Delphi panel that was formed. And each of these sort of influenced what values we eventually adopted for the three S-curve parameters. In case of TMA, we directly linked our assumptions about parameter values to the interventions and milestones planned in the MTI. And in the next slide, I'll sort of go over each of these assumptions. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So as I mentioned before, as I mentioned before, market potential is a total number of households who eventually adopt the product. Now, to estimate market potential, California-wide market potential, we segmented the population on various attributes that are expected to influence the decision to adopt the product. The market research that we conducted played a key role in helping us identify what these attributes are, and those are the attributes I have listed here. First is the household type, multifamily versus single family, the current HVAC system, primary heating and cooling equipment that people have, whether the household lives in urban or rural region, and whether they own the housing unit or they rent the housing unit. Now, each of these four attributes helped us segment the entire California population, roughly 13 million households, into 80 mutually exclusive subsegments. And our next step was for each of these 80 subsegments, we estimated the market potential. And that was step 2. Next slide, please. Sorry. So this is an example of the subsegmentation, the segmentation of the household population that we have done. The actual numbers are not interesting. I know it's a very dense slide, so I'm going to highlight the data points that are relevant and important for the purpose of this discussion. This one gives us urban household owners, and disaggregated by multifamily and single family. The current HVAC equipment, the primary equipment used for heating and cooling, we have 10 different attributes of those. So effectively, then what we have is 20 subsegments that you see here. If you look at multifamily, this is 316,000 households out here, which is a small proportion, less than 10% of the 4.3 million households in California, because most of the multifamily housing units are rented. But this definitely represents a large proportion of single family, 6 million over approximately 8.2 million. And similar to this, we had urban households who rent their units, rural households who own their units, and rural households who rent the units. So together they add up to 80 subsegments. Next slide, please. Okay. So here we made a number of assumptions that helped us estimate the potential of each of the 80 subsegments. I'm going to highlight a couple that are most relevant. The first is we expect high eventual adoption of room heat pumps among households with existing inefficient zonal heating or cooling system. So that's the red on the left side, and I've highlighted. So people who have electric resistance heating, people who have zonal gas or oil heaters, they have very high costs associated with these inefficient zonal systems, and these costs are going to rise as cost of energy is going to rise, and we expect households to gradually adopt, most of these households to gradually adopt zonal heat pumps. The second big assumption that we made is the one in blue on the right top. Low potential among single-family households who have central gas furnace and/or central cooling system. We believe that single-family households with central systems will eventually migrate to central heat pumps. They're going to capitalize on the existing infrastructure in the house, like the ductworks and the electric system, to make a cost-effective transition to central HP. And I know the numbers are very low, but if you look at it, it's almost like close to 4.5 of the 8.5 million households, 8.7 million households are single-family households do have a central system. And we assume that many of them, very few of them are going to adopt a zonal heat pump or a room heat pump. And that explains why single-family households have lower adoption forecasted. And the third assumption, which is in green on the right side, is in general, we assume that multifamily households are going to prefer room heat pump over mini splits. So assuming that households are going to adopt a zonal heat pump, multifamily are going to prefer room heat pumps because of better aesthetics, because the condenser unit in a mini split sort of hangs out in the balcony, and that has code issues. But that's not the case with room heat pump, and hence there will be a greater preference for room heat pump among multifamily households. So these are sort of the three big assumptions that are applicable in baseline. They're also applicable in in presence of MTI. But there are two specific additional assumptions that we made in presence of the MTI, and I'm going to highlight them here. First is we assume across all subsegments, urban, rural, owner, renter, there will be higher eventual adoption of room heat pump in presence of the MTI compared to the baseline. And this may be directly tied to all the various CalMTA interventions. Ellen talked about these efforts to build market awareness, including removing labeling misalignment and ambiguity. Then there's this CalMTA intervention about encouraging value-added features like air filtration system. That's going to increase the attractiveness of RHPs. Room heat pumps are going to be more price competitive relative to other technologies in presence of the MTI than in baseline. All of this, we believe, is going to drive up the adoption of room heat pump in presence of MTI than in baseline. And then the other one is high potential in rental units. Now, this is very relevant for multifamily households where 90% of the housing units are rented. In both baseline and TMA, we expect rental units to have lower adoption than owned units, all else equal, primarily because of the split incentive problem. And the reason is, property managers may be reluctant to invest in upgrading to heat pumps due to upfront costs, due to uncertainty in recouping the investments. And then when we did our market research, we also heard about property managers having concerns about product durability. Our assumption is in presence of the MTI intervention, the scale of the split incentive problem would be lower. In other words, more rental units are going to adopt this product. There'll be greater propensity to purchase room heat pumps among property managers. Next slide, please. Okay, that was market. Actually, this is the result of the market potential. So, as I said, we for each subsegment we calculated the market potential, and what you see here is for the entire single family and the multifamily segments. What is the market potential in baseline? So for single family, it is 13%. So eventually, in the long term, 13% of single family households are expected to adopt in the baseline. So that represents the ceiling. The equivalent for multifamily is 19%. And in presence of the MTI interventions, because of different reasons that I cited, the ceiling is going to be raised from 13% to 24% for single family and double to 38% in case of multifamily. Now, I should reiterate, these are not estimated market adoption. These represent the ceiling, the maximum market potential for this product. Next slide, please. Okay. So that was parameter one. The next two parameters are much shorter to describe. So this one is the year of inflection. And as I mentioned, year of inflection is a point where the growth rate of adoption is the maximum. Before the inflection point, as I mentioned, the adoption is increasing as early adopters and innovators and people who are keen of this technology, they embrace the technology. But after the inflection point, the adoption rate starts to slow down until it reaches the saturation point. In general, you can assume that technologies with earlier inflection might have rapid adoption compared to those which have later inflection. Identifying or estimating the year of inflection is very challenging. If you open up literature, it involves a lot of historical data and advanced statistical techniques to sort of extract what is the year of inflection. We don't have any historical data for this product. This is a new product. So to understand or to estimate year of inflection, we broke up the problem into estimating the year of takeoff, which is the left side of the curve, and the year of close to saturation, which is the right side of the curve. And if we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, and here I've sort of tried to explain what these points are. So the year of takeoff is the point where adoption of the technology starts to accelerate significantly. It sort of marks the, if you refer to the theory of diffusion by Rogers, it sort of marks the transition from early experimentation to a somewhat broader market acceptance of the product. And it is, there's an uptick in adoption rate at the year of inflection. And for us in this project, the year of takeoff is directly linked to removal of one of the biggest barriers that Ellen talked about, which is availability of California appropriate products, products that fit into sliding windows and operate optimally at temperatures below 40 degrees. Now, as I mentioned before, in absence of the MTI, we expect many of these products at reasonable costs will be introduced in 2037. But the MTI plans to sort of pull forward the introduction, and hence we assume that the year of takeoff in presence of the MTI is 2029. So that's on the left side. Now, if you go to the right side, which is the year of saturation. Now, what we understood from our Delphi panel is it will take almost 30 years for once the product sort of takes off, it will take around 30 years for room heat pumps to reach a saturation level. And that's where the assumption of 2067 for BMA is coming from. But in presence of MTI, we believe that all these interventions that we spoke about is going to reduce the time, the duration it takes for the market to reach saturation. In other words, the adoption is going to be faster, and hence the saturation we assumed it to be 2053. Year of inflection, then we assumed is sort of the midpoint between the two. So in case of baseline 2067 minus 2037 divided by 2, and similarly for TMA. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are the two other parameters. The next one is the shape, the steepness of the S curve. Again, in case of BMA, we drew it directly from inputs from the Delphi panel. They gave us forecasts of how the adoption would be, and we fit an S curve, and based on the S curve, we realized the assumed value is roughly 0.1. And then we reviewed literature to see how will regulatory interventions, how will market transformation initiatives sort of increase the rate of adoption. And the multiple papers we reviewed, but the one paper that I want to highlight is looked at adoption of EVs in Norway versus US. In Norway, where there have been substantial government interventions to increase EV adoption compared to US. And based on the difference in the rate of growth between Norway and US, in case of EV market, we sort of assume that in our case, the steepness of the curve, the rate would increase by 25%. So that was, and there were multiple other papers that we also reviewed, but that was one paper that was most influential in helping us come up with this assumption. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is my last slide. Um, okay, so all the two S curves that we came up with, those S curves gave us adoption in terms of proportion of households, which can be easily converted to number of households. From there, to convert that to units of RHP, units of the widget that is adopted, we made some assumptions about how many units each multifamily households and single family households will adopt. And to do that, we looked at current ownership of portable ACs, window ACs, portable heaters, and sort of discounted the fact that uh, a room heat pump will sort of take the place of two units, a heater as well as a cooler. And based on that, we assumed 1.25 units of room heat pump for multifamily and 1.5 units of room heat pump on single family. And that was sort of the key assumption that helped us go from number of households to units of RHP. Someone in the panel asked about how did we come up with RA program verified. I don't have a slide, but I can speak through that. So that's the column, the third column with data. Again, we reviewed various the plans of utilities, and of course, this is a very new technology, and there's very limited mention of this product. So what we did is we looked at other products and from other case studies, and we divided the forecast period into early initiative, mid initiative, and late initiative. There are some statistics from the Northwest market which showed that around 40% of the adoption in mid initiative is attributed to RA verified units, and that was sort of our anchor point. And we sort of assumed that there are there are very few RA programs expected in early initiative stage, and in the late initiative, the scale of the RA initiatives is going to wind down to 0% by 2045. So we made some of those assumptions based on observations from other markets, and that was sort of the basis for the third column. And the last thing I want to repeat is, each of these steps then led us to the incremental net of non-IOU, which is the 1.7 million units of RHP. That's my last slide, and I'll request Matt to take over.
Thank you, Lori.
Can I jump in with this one thing? Just wanted to say for Keon, in addition to, since Gord didn't have a slide on it, I just wanted to point out that the description of how we estimated verified resource acquisition savings is in Appendix B, starting on page 27. We have a lot of material, so I thought if you want to get there quickly, you could get the details there.
You had a question?
Oh, I just wanted to flag what I think is a typo on the one slide back. The RA program verified total number is inaccurate.
Yeah.
It looks like the cell to the left was just carried over to the right, not the formula, but the total number.
Should be like 30.
Good catch. Wow.
I'm 35.
I have looked at the table multiple times and I didn't find the mistake. Yeah, but it's a mistake, yes.
25.
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
Okay, Gori, if you can get that corrected, that gets, if the right one gets posted.
And while we're at it,
Please.
we did identify another number on a previous slide that doesn't match Appendix B.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. Karina.
Also, I'm a little concerned with the market kind of assumptions on, can you go back a few slides, go back a bit? I think on the, when you start identifying the categories of like the houses and stuff like that, it was like 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so I really like this right here where it has like, there's assumptions based on the type of cooling and heating system, which is really great. I guess one of my first questions is, for California, how do you divide the state into urban and rural when our state's very suburban? So I think that I'm very curious, what was the definitions there to divide the state up?
So we took the definition. We took the definition directly from U.S. Census. I have to go back and check what is the exact US Census definition, but that's a definition that was adopted by EIA Rex 2020, and we adopted it. And I can get back to you on what was the US Census definition for urban versus rural.
Yeah, that just,
The one thing I should say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I'm just saying, it just concerns me to divide the state into urban and rural, when I think a lot of the state is suburban, you know, so I think, so that, I don't know if that was a fair way to divide the state up. And I'm also shocked that climate zone isn't being considered as an adoption factor, as to, I think that we deal with more extreme heat here than we do with the cold, but it's very different throughout the state. So I know that we ideally wanna, to reduce GHG emission, we wanna focus more on heating than on cooling. But how does trying to make your apartment or multifamily unit cooler can also be a motivating factor to get a unit to then make it more comfortable in the warm? So I just feel like there's these assumptions that I don't, like, again, I really like how it's broken down by the type of heating and cooling, like that's awesome. But the the urban rural splits, and then the lack of consideration for climate zone, I think doesn't seem like a fair analysis of the market in California.
Okay, yeah, let me clarify this. So when they call it urban, what they include is also suburban. Almost 90% of California households, more than 90% of California households fall in what US Census calls as urban. So when I say here urban, it definitely does include suburban. And yeah, I see where the confusion is coming from. So this is suburban. Think of this as urban/suburban versus a rural, which is less than 10% of the population.
Yeah, like
As
that
far as
itself
the-
doesn't seem, like that itself doesn't seem like a fair divide of California, if 90%
Yeah,
of what
yeah.
you're looking at category, like if there would have been a more just way of getting an actual. Cause yeah, 90% of your data is in one category. Did you really split it up effectively on, like, to really get a grasp of what is the market in California? So I think that's why it kind of concerns me. Like a lot of the assumptions, again, don't take into consideration climate.
Let me clarify
I-
one thing. Oh, go ahead, Corey.
Well, I want to say, yes, we did look at, so if you go up one slide, slide number 40, please. So we initially started with climate zones. In fact, we divided the entire state based on marine, three broad climate categories: marine, hot, dry, and there was one more I can't remember right now. We did include that as a variable, and there was one other variable. So we did start with 6 attributes, and eventually we narrowed it down to 4. Part of the reason is we wanted it to be a tractable problem. As I mentioned, just these 4 led to 80 different subsegments, and for each of those 80 subsegments, we had to come up with a potential. By including climate zone as one other dimension, that would have increased the number of subsegments from 80 multiplied by 3, which is 240, which was making it more complex. The second is we still had, when we had climate zone as one of the dimensions, one of the things we realized is it was not making much of a difference, in the sense households with hot, dry climate are likely to purchase room heat pump for cooling reasons, while households in marine are likely to purchase it for heating reasons. So as we went through some of our assumptions, it didn't quite make as much difference as the other 4. So when we ranked our attributes, that variable was important, but was ranked at 5th number, and hence I sort of dropped it.
That's interesting.
But point taken, ideally, not just that, there are a couple of other variables I realized that we should consider to come up with a more accurate estimate. It's just that the utility of adding one more attribute was not as much. Karen, I cut you off.
No, I'm really glad you went into that level of detail, which was beyond what I would have been able to go into, though I do recall that we went through that whole process. The thing that I just wanted to make really clear, is that these four segment types were used to come up with 80 segments. I know he just said it, I want to say it again. So there was no one of 80 segments that was the majority. So it was actually it's segmented at I think one could almost argue like so granular that like, but we did go through that process of trying to bring it to a reasonable level that we thought actually correlated with what we learned from market research could be like market differences in preference or what they would do. So yeah, no, Corey's explanation was much better. I just wanted to say, like, rest assured, and there was no big chunk of the market that was assumed to do the same thing, because by each combination of these segments, then we also looked at those 10 different, what type of HVAC equipment do they have right now?
So Jeff had a question and then Peter, or you're done? Okay, Peter, go ahead. And then just to update you guys, I think we're gonna take a break now and then we'll come back and Matt will finish his piece. So go ahead, Peter.
I just thought it was a really interesting issue. Thanks for that so far. And I'm wondering, even if it didn't make a difference in terms of adoption, what about in terms of the benefits? Because if you're in a hot climate, your benefits are primarily going to be on the cooling side. And in the colder climate, they're probably going to be on the heating side with very different costs and greenhouse gas implications.
That will come up in unit energy savings.
Great.
Great, well, thanks, Stacy. Again, my name is Matt Wisniewski. I am a senior associate at the Catalyst Group. And today I'm going to walk everybody through our cost effectiveness modeling and results.
Uh-oh. Okay, click it one more time. There you go.
So today what we're going to start with is total system benefit. So I want to point out total system benefit came into effect in California in 2024. It is our newest cost effectiveness metric. It's composed of life cycle energy, capacity, and greenhouse gas benefits. So this is sort of everything that these initiatives are driving, valued, combined into a stream of single dollarized benefits. One of the primary reasons that TSB is used in California is to show the relative value of energy savings during those high value hours of the year, and then eventually to encourage adoption of program designs and measures that really maximize that value. As you can see from the 2024 avoided cost calculator, I took one of the graphics from their slide presentation. Depending on the hour of the day or the time of the year, there is a very big variance in the value of energy saved. So this graphic shows the value of a megawatt hour across a day, 24-hour period. During the middle of the day, you can see that electric savings are running about $50 per hour. But when we get into the mid to late afternoon, that benefit jumps all the way above 300. So for all of the benefits that we used, we adopted this time-sensitive framework that we use for TSB, we use for the other metrics, and that's where you're going to see all the dollarized benefits for these MTIs being discussed. There are 3 other test perspectives in California. I apologize for folks who have heard this 100 times or very familiar with cost effectiveness in California, but we've got the total resource cost test. This comes from the perspective of sort of the energy system overall. If this includes the utilities, the program administrators, and ratepayers, benefits in the total resource cost test are essentially what you saw for TSB. But costs are those initiative costs minus incentives. So we don't count incentives in as a TRC cost because we consider those a pass-through. But we do include incremental measure costs, which is a piece we'll talk about later. There's also the program administrator cost test. This is the test from the MTI perspective. So this takes again the benefits that the MTI would see from the initiative and compares it to the costs, including incentives that the MTI will spend over the lifetime of the initiative. And then finally, the societal cost test. So this takes the perspective of California as a whole. It includes essentially the same costs as the TRC, but in addition to the benefits of the TRC, you also get upweighted value for greenhouse gas emissions. And another key component, as Karen mentioned earlier, is a lower discount rate, which really improves the value or increases the value of savings in later years of a measure or of the initiative as a whole. So when we talk about what the sort of framework for the evaluation is, we talked about replacement scenarios, essentially comparing what would happen in the counterfactual, where there was no MTI, with the efficient equipment that the MTI promoted. So you can see we have a bunch of different scenarios here, depending on what was replaced. So in an example case, you might have a room AC and an electric resistance heater get replaced by a window heat pump. I will note that there are incremental measure costs on the side, and you can see that in a number of these scenarios, those incremental measure costs are actually negative. That's because in a number of these cases, replacing two pieces of technology in a potential situation with one efficient piece of technology actually is cheaper. And so this results in sort of a series of interesting developments in some of the test results. That's why we also show perspective where some of those are set to 0 as opposed to treated as negative. So there are a number of key inputs that we use for cost effectiveness that get broken down in essentially sort of two key areas. The first are technology inputs, or what we're calling those inputs that are driven by the decision to adopt a particular kind of technology. These include unit energy savings, incremental measure costs, load shapes, effective useful life. We also have the inputs that are set by either regulatory constraints, the structure is set up in California to evaluate things, or the set of designed program inputs. All of these feed into the cost effectiveness results that we'll be showing here in a few slides. I did want to mention these colors. The green, these represent our core benefits, and gold sort of represent the core costs. The ones that are neither green nor gold, they're in the blue shades. Those are sort of either affecting both costs and benefits, or are a function of sort of modulating the costs and benefits. So they themselves are not a source of cost or benefits, but they affect how the costs and benefits are developed. So let's go into those technology-defined inputs. The first is unit energy savings. So savings were determined by our partners at 2050. They looked at a number of different pieces of technology, and they used energy modeling to come up with the relative savings between the baseline cases and the efficient cases. They did this for both electricity and natural gas, and we will have negative benefits, i.e. increased load in the case of fuel switching through electrification. So we are accounting for situations where we're taking a piece of natural gas equipment off the grid and therefore adding electric load. We also looked at incremental measure costs. So we researched using California retailer data what all of the costs were for both the baseline measures that we're replacing, your room ACs, your gas wall furnaces, your electric space heaters, and then the efficient technologies that we're going to be pushing through the MTI if it's approved. They can, again, as I said, be negative if that room heat pump is cheaper than the equipment that it replaces. And also over time, these incremental measure costs decline as we assume through sort of increased production and economies of scale that these efficient technologies become relatively less expensive compared to baseline as they become more common in the market. That's the question.
So, the law on this analysis, which is very hard to deal with any other way, is you're assuming your baseline that two pieces of equipment are retired at the same time. And people don't do that. Zeroing out the negative numbers is probably as good a way of dealing with that as anything, although it's not the right answer, there is no right answer because an infinite number of things that are happening out there. But it does kind of overstate the concept of the baseline and say, well, they would have bought an air conditioner and resistance rating at the same time that they bought this new thing in the counterfactual case. It's just, what do you do with it?
Yeah, it's complicated, so we do have to make some sort of generic assumptions about how things behaved and yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have perfect knowledge, as you're rightly pointing out.
And if we did, we couldn't model it.
Yeah, exactly. So after incremental measure costs, we also have the load shape. So load shape is essentially the probability that any piece of equipment is going to be running in any hour of the year. So we do have load shapes for the full 8760 load profile of a technology. For California, for the room heat pump measure, we relied on a series of DEER-based HVAC load shapes to create a combined load shape across the state that take into account both a series of different kinds of technologies being replaced, but also the variable sort of climates that exist inside California in terms of when there is peak heating and peak cooling. And then finally, we have the effective useful life. So this is important in defining how each individual piece of technology, once adopted, how long that is going to be in service. For this initiative, we took this from the California ETRM, and right now the room heat pump value has a 9-year EUL in the Cal ETRM. So beyond those technology inputs, we also have program and or regulatory inputs. So the biggest one here are avoided costs. We use the 2024 California Avoided Cost Calculator to generate essentially all of those TSB or benefits in every hour of the year. Those are broken down into essentially 3 categories: energy, this can be both electricity and natural gas; grid, or those benefits accruing to the infrastructure of the energy distribution grid; and then greenhouse gas avoided costs. There also are some other costs, including refrigerants that are involved, but those are the 3 primary categories of avoided costs we use for our TSB calculation. We also have a discount rate. Obviously, the MTI travels over time for a fairly long window. In addition to the 20-year period of the MTI, we also have that 9-year EUL. So those do actually relate to each other. We do incorporate the full savings of a MTI measure that's installed in that last year. We do give it the full 9 years of credit for its savings, so that extends all the way through. In order to get everything apples to apples compared in terms of 2024 dollars, we use a discount rate. It's very common in cost effectiveness. For the TRC and PAC, we use the 7.3% value set in the avoided cost calculator. And for SCT, we use a lower 3% discount rate, again, set in California policy. So we're keeping everything in line with the other evaluations going on in California.
Question.
Yes.
Is that real or nominal?
I believe those are in real dollars.
Wow. 7.3% is high.
Yeah. It is. It's
In real terms.
I believe so, but yes.
Can check on that too.
Yeah, we'll double check. I'm pretty sure my brain might be scrambled having spent a lot
I
of
know
time.
you don't have any choice in this matter, but coming from the Northwest, I'm just sort of amazed. That's a very steep discount rate.
Yeah, it is one of the larger ones, yes.
You may have said this and I missed it. You assume, at the end of the board, that efficient equipment that you had installed in this model is replaced at a cost. What do you do after the 9 years?
Oh, so in the cases where a particular piece of equipment works for 9 years and then comes out of service, I believe our market adoption assumes that it continues to be that level of efficiency moving forward. I'm not sure that the initiative is given full credit for like the entirety of the period, but that level of efficiency is, we don't return to a previous inefficient level.
You assign a cost to the replacement.
I don't think we assign a second cost. I will, because I will have to double check that because the market adoption just has the total number of units moved by the MTI. So if it is considered an MTI moved unit, then yes, it is included. If it were not considered an MTI moved unit, it wouldn't be included. So as those two curves move, the difference in the cost is included over time.
If it's not in the baseline, it's in market transformation rates of cost.
Yes,
And a benefit.
and a benefit. Oh, I didn't talk about SCD adders. So in addition to the avoided costs and the discount rate for the societal cost test, there are additional adders that are part of that equation. We touched on earlier. Those include benefits based on the social cost of carbon. There's two scenarios, a high scenario and a base case scenario. And then there's also an additional benefit for avoided methane leakage. We also include the MTI lifetime as an input. So this is essentially the period where costs start running through the end of that initiative lifetime in 2045. Phase 3 runs 2026 through 2045 for that 20-year period, but we do include the costs for phase 2 as well. Those initiative costs that I mentioned earlier are set by the MTI. They include all of the costs that are going to be borne running the initiative, including research and evaluation, administration, marketing, and any flow down incentives that would be part of the initiative for any measure. I will say that costs are largely front loaded, so those tend to be contained in the first few years of the initiative. This shows up a bit in some of the results later on when we look at sort of how the program evolves over time. So this is a screen that Karen showed before. This is just a revisiting of our TSB and TRC PAC and SET results. So not much to say here besides what's already been said, but again, under our TRC based TSB, we're looking at $521 million in benefits, 1.4 billion under the SCT. And then we do have two sets of scores, again, with those negative incremental measure costs in a number of the adoption cases. You do get a very large TRC because those incremental measure costs are actually, in some cases, negative. They don't necessarily outweigh the combined initiative costs, but they are relatively small. And in the SCT, I believe they do flip. So that's why you get that negative. You actually have negative costs as part of the divider. So I'll talk a little bit about this. Oh, yes.
Man, I asked you this during the break, but I thought maybe I could just air it out so everybody can hear it. For the baseline adoption, obviously the initiative is not responsible for those.
Right.
But by reducing the cost of technology, everybody in that baseline group will pay less for their units. They're not going to continue to pay the higher price that they would have otherwise paid. So there's additional savings. You're not counting the benefits, the savings from those, because they've been adopted anyway, but there's dollar savings that you could, but they're not including here.
Yes, we don't include them in here, but you're right. That is a potential area where anyone in California would benefit from the initiative being run because those costs for efficient equipment are going to drop. So I did want to take a second and talk about the cost effectiveness schedule. What this represents is essentially a perspective of time. So we looked at essentially 5, 10, and then 20 years into the initiative, what would have been spent and what would the accrued benefits would be. And you can see that there is a general tendency for benefits to grow over time. And then essentially what you have in estimated incremental investment on the bottom is the remaining cost. Karen, am I getting this right? This is the costs that would be left to spend to achieve the full goal, or is it the costs that have already been spent?
So the way, this is a little bit funny, but so I think it's best to just like interpret the numbers. So what this basically says is, as you would expect in 5 years, after this is advanced and funded, hopefully, and California decides to invest in this MTI, at the end of 2030, the payback's not going to be very impressive. And I know you guys know why, because I know I've sound like broken record every time I say, think about Lynette's chart and think about the benefits come in the out years. That's why. Okay. But through 2030, the budget that you see in Appendix H is 36.4 million. That's what it costs just to get 5 years in without much to show for it by 2030. So the way this table is organized, it basically shows you how much more, that's what that row is that says estimated incremental.
Yeah.
How much more do you need to spend in the next 5 years to get to the numbers you see above? So it's a little confusing because on the top, you're looking at incremental values, or you're looking at cumulative values, excuse me. And in the investment, you're looking at incremental value. So it just basically says that the cumulative value by 2035 would be 79 million. You've crossed the threshold, the break-even year, because your TRC is 1.21, even the adjusted value. It takes you another 21.5 million to get there. You know, this is a conversation that we had with Christy early on, you know, where she said, okay, you know, yes, we understand the profile of the investment. It's a long-term investment, but how much more will it take to get where we need to get? And so that 21.5 is kind of your answer. And then in the final 10 years, when we're mostly going to be in long-term monitoring and tracking, very little incremental investment, but just look what happens to the payback, to the return on investment, right? So is this, in a way, just like another look at that same point being made over and over again, which is, this is a long-term investment. This is why California said it wanted to have a, you know, market transformation administrator, because this is a investment profile that wasn't previously in the portfolio. So
And I'll just note that in 2035, that's 10 years out. And you've already crossed the TRC threshold of 1.0. You've got a benefit cost ratio above 1. And the additional 10 years of monitoring costs almost nothing, but you're documenting that in fact, you're accumulating benefits all the way up to 521 million. That's typical. I'll just say I've seen this profile, that it's about 10 years to get to that VC ratio on an HVAC measure, market transformation, MTI. So this doesn't surprise me, but it's also illustrative of it's the long-term benefit that you're really gonna you really see the benefit cost ratio go to something very large. And that's why you're doing this work. If you shut it all down in 2030, you made a very bad investment. If you hang in there till 2045, you made an incredible investment. So it really has to be in for the long term.
Peter, add to that excellent summary, that's at a discount rate of 7.3%.
Oh, right, yeah. At 3%, this would look even more dramatic.
Randall?
Now, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, if you put in a room heat pump where there was in a home that was previously heating only, you're going to increase total energy use because they'll probably use air conditioning. So how is that taken into account?
So we have a couple different scenarios, exactly like what you're talking about, where there is going to be essentially negative benefits on the cooling side, but some savings on the heating side. That is dealt with by the share of adoption that we say are going to be affected in that case. And I believe that's a relatively small share. I'm trying to find the exact number in my note, but I think it's something along the order of 6% of cases are going into place where there was no previous cooling and now there is cooling, so that cooling only load is added on top of some savings in heating. And it could be that still is a net negative, right, over time, because that heating is not completely offset by the increased cooling. But it's a small proportion of California homes where there was no previous cooling, and we don't assume that any cooling would have happened absent the MTI.
Seems pretty conservative.
There's one more result slide that we kind of wanted to look at. So the first number that is not bolded in the middle here, that you've already seen, these are the TRC and PAC ratios and TSB. For the net incremental impacts for IOU territory only in California for the big three, we also then look at what those net incremental impacts would be statewide. This would include the approximately 26% of California residents who don't live in one of the big three territories, but would be impacted by the MTI. It is a statewide transformation program, so we would expect people in SMUD and people in Los Angeles are going to participate indirectly. The initiative costs don't change, so the divisor is roughly the same. There are some incremental measure costs, obviously, that will go up as adoption goes up. But you can see that TSB grows from 521 million to 640 million when we look at the net incremental impacts statewide.
And I would just add, you said it perfectly well. I just for emphasis, I just want to say, because you did say the word participate, and I just want to make clear, by virtue of the fact that we're working with markets and not with customers, right? Like we're working to change markets. So when the new products that are suitable for California become available, they will become available in all of California.
Right.
It's kind of like Peter's point before. It's like everybody will benefit by the fact that there are now products that they can choose to purchase and will purchase, regardless of whether they live in IOU service territory or not. So for the same investment that we are making, we absolutely will calculate the numbers as we have, on the left there, which is what we've been talking about all afternoon. However, I do think it's worth taking a look at what the additional benefit to the rest, if you consider the entire statewide benefit, because this is, an idea here is to help California meet its goals as a state. So I think it's important to look at, even if it's not what we use to calculate our net incremental impact.
Yeah, I just have a question. When you're looking at loads, for cooling degree days, are you looking at climate change and increased number of cooling degree days over time?
I don't know in terms of specifics if that is, I don't know personally. I don't want to speak with authority, but I do know that that is part of the Appendix B write-up to get into the discussion of energy model. And if we want to discuss that and follow up via email, we certainly can.
You're saying in the out years.
Yeah, I mean,
we're gonna have higher
It's
temperature.
getting warmer,
Getting
Yeah.
warmer, there's gonna be more cooling degree days.
but there'll be less heating, so.
For some of that, which is, so when we're calculating heating degree days and cooling degree days, we're using TMY3 data, which is, rearward looking. And there will be new data, but currently, I think this has come up in a number of MTIs, including Windows, where it's really impactful, which is, we're underestimating, cooling degree days for.
For the future.
Okay, Jeff, and then I think we'll move to the next segment.
I'm actually just gonna pigpile on what Karen just said, but I'm looking at Haley.
I'm not. Yeah.
I just,
I'm looking up some decision language.
okay,
That I
because
recall, but.
as a matter of state policy, the CalMTA was established to do something different than the conventional IOU resource acquisition programs, which are utility territory specific. And I think it's absolutely critical that you show this picture every time going forward, because this is a different animal than the conventional programs. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't spillover effects, Carol. There are spillover effects from resource acquisition programs, but they're not designed for that. This is designed for that. This is designed to change the entire California market. And there needs to be some recognition somewhere that there's more benefits beyond just the funding IOU territories. So when, let's say, a future governor issues an executive order to look at cost effectiveness of programs, you might want to have the total statewide impact included in those calculus, just from a policy perspective. So that's, I'm looking at Haley over there saying from an
I found the right paragraph.
advocacy perspective.
Yeah, my recollection, and I just always want to fact check that, is that the commission actually discussed the unique value that a statewide independent administrator could bring by
Yeah.
being able to to coordinate with other entities, other states, really look at the state as a whole, and there were benefits that could come from that versus having an IOU or IOU administrators. But I just have to check my facts because I remember writing about that from an advocacy perspective. And I believe that it's incorporated in the decision. I'm like within a page of where the commission
Okay,
is.
all right.
But anyway, I think my recommendation is that it is, of course, appropriate to talk about the net incremental impacts, IOU territories, that's where the funding is coming from, and that's where the calculations really are critical. But I do think that it is also valuable to mention the net incremental impacts statewide. I think that's an important part of what's happening here. But I'll nail down this fact check situation.
Thanks, Matt.